Okay, welcome back. Here we are at the Missional Vocation Pathway. We're in our last video in the first week of Module 4. Today we're talking about economic systems. This whole week we've been talking about exile. Started off with the overview of the biblical theme. Then we talked about how it feels to be in exile, what our temptations are to either escape or to conform. Last video, we talked about different philosophical systems that we live among, and now we're talking about some economic systems. We covered secular humanism and pluralism in brief last time. Now we're going to talk about two huge forces that dominate our experience of consumerism and capitalism. And once again, we are going to just barely touch the surface on these topics, but it's helpful for us to get a quick overview of the forces that we live among so that we can recognize how it affects us. First, we'll address capitalism, and you could take an entire college course on capitalism. We just want to get a little bit of an idea. The first goal for our time is to recognize that we live in a capitalist society. Again, it's like water. We live among it, we operate in it every day, but we don't always think about it, about how it affects us. And then we want to understand some of the various forces and influences prevalent in capitalism. Our goal is not to critique capitalism. Our goal is not to affirm it, to defend it. We're simply trying to observe and recognize that capitalist forces operate upon us for either good or ill, and usually some combination of the two. First, let's start by defining it. Capitalism is an economic system in which private individuals or businesses own capital goods. Notice that word own. Capitalism is about ownership. At the same time, business owners or capitalists employ workers, labor, who only receive wages. Labor does not own the means of production, but only uses them on behalf of the owners of capital. So there's a distinction between those who own the enterprises and those who work among them. There are employers and there are employees. That's helpful to realize because we just take that for granted, but that's not always been the case in all parts of the world in all times. And it's not the way all economic systems function. The production of goods and services, how stuff happens within capitalism, is based on supply and demand in the general market. It's known as a market economy, rather than through central planning. So instead of some central force deciding we need 1,000 cars and they should be priced at this much, capitalism simply relies on the forces of the market, on the people who are purchasing and consuming cars in order to set the price and determine how much is needed. This is known as a planned economy or a command economy in contrast to a capitalist economy. Planned economy is one where some central force is deciding those things. Now, the pillars of capitalism are values that are so deeply ingrained in our system and in our psyche as Americans and as people who live here in this country that it's incredibly useful for us to recognize those because they aren't just things that affect our economic lives. They affect our lives in every aspect. Capitalism believes in private property. People own things. It is safe to own something. I can own something and I can know that it will stay with me and I can transfer ownership from myself to someone else with a document or a transaction and I can trust that that transaction is protected. Capitalism is built on self-interest. It's the idea that if I look out for myself and everybody else looks out for themselves, and we do so with some ethical dimension to it, it's not an amoral system. There is some ethics, but if I'm essentially worried about myself and everybody's worried about them, then things will work out in the end. Capitalism promotes competition. There's this deeply held belief that competitive forces actually make everybody better. Now, again, we're not defending that belief. We're not criticizing that belief. We just want to recognize that that idea that competing forces produce something better is so deeply ingrained in our culture that it drives relationships, it drives companies, it drives families, it drives education, it drives all sorts of things. We just want to be aware of that. Capitalism believes in market pricing, that prices are determined in a decentralized manner by the market, that what somebody's willing to pay for something determines its value. And you can think about how perhaps that mindset of a value is determined by what somebody is willing to give for it, again, reaches farther than simply economics. Capitalism believes in choice. Consumers, products, investors, companies, they have freedom to choose what they make, what they consume, what they prefer. And because of all of these things, the government itself must be limited. Government protects the rights of the people and the businesses. It maintains order, but government doesn't interfere with pricing and supply and models because all of that is generally left up to the system itself. Now, of course, there are nuances and there are spectrums of what limited government looks like, but capitalism in general ascribes to all of these things. One interesting thing to note is that it is really the church who led towards the development of capitalism. Michael Novak claims that it was the church more than any other agency that put in place what Weber called the preconditions of capitalism, the rule of law and a bureaucracy for resolving disputes rationally, a specialized and mobile labor force, the institutional permanence that allows for transgenerational investment and sustained intellectual and physical efforts, together with the accumulation of long-term capital and a zest for discovery, enterprise, wealth creation, and new undertakings. A lot of big ideas there, but the gist is that it was the Christian West. It was principles that came to culture because of who Christ was and what it means to be a church and understand the work of God in the world that laid the groundwork for capitalism to be developed. Miroslav Volf says this: the rise and development of capitalism, together with what has been termed, rightly or wrongly, the Protestant worth ethic, gave birth to the Western world of total work. Think about that phrase. That's the world that we live in, the world of total work. Work has come to pervade and rule the lives of men and women, be it in the form of indefatigable or cruelly enforced industriousness, pure and simple, in the initial stages of the industrial nation's development, be it in combination with frantically pursued leisure at later stages. Everything is frantic. Everything is work. Everything has this intensity to it. That's what Volf claims has come as a result of capitalism and this work ethic from Protestantism. We might make a few criticisms, and people make these kinds of criticisms of capitalism, that it treats labor, people's work, as a commodity, and that it is not inherently valuable, which makes it easy to exploit. There's this sense that workers' lives are alienated from their work, that what they do isn't inherent to who they are, it's very separate. The market tends to be unstable, wealth gets distributed in an unfair manner, preference is given to property owners, the ones who have the capital, versus the laborers who seek to produce and develop it. And then there's this destructive nature of the profit motive, that if profit is the only driver, then the environment, culture, personhood, consumerism, waste, all of that is sacrificed on the altar of profit. Bob Goudsword says this: capitalism is a form of societal organization that is specifically directed towards growth and change. This is another dynamic of capitalism that we want to understand. He says, in this specific orientation towards progress, capitalism appears to this day to be a recognizable, essential element of our social structuration. Instead of being the creator of progress, man has become its servant. His point is that everything has to progress. You, your family, your church, your company. There is no life apart from progressing. That comes as a result of this mindset of capitalism. Those are some of the things we really want to observe about how capitalism shapes the way we think about our lives and the world we live in. On top of that, then, is this sense of consumerism, that because capitalism has to progress and produce and create things, that we as individuals within the capitalist system exist as consumers. We've talked a bit about capitalism now. So we want to move on to this idea of consumerism, which is a mindset that we are taught that is a system laid on top of capitalism. But again, it affects everything we do in all aspects of our lives. Within a capitalist society, the identity of an individual is that of a consumer. I operate as a cog, as a gear in the machinery of capitalism, and my role to play is to consume goods that society produces. That's one of the key roles that I play. So I'm an Apple guy, or I'm an Android guy, or I'm a Ford guy, or I drive a Tesla, or I live in this city, or I do this kind of thing. We construct identities based on the things we consume. Consumers construct their identities through their brand choices based on congruence between brand image and self-image. I want to be like the things that I consume. Thus, the meaning and value of a brand is not just its ability to express the self, but also its role in helping consumers create and build their self-identities. My identity as a consumer is connected to the products and the services that define me. I read this book, I listen to this podcast, I do this thing, and all of that is not just the things that I do externally, but we have a sense of owning that, of that constructing the self that I present to the world. Investopedia says this: consumerism is the idea that increasing the consumption of goods and services purchased in the market is always a desirable goal, and that a person's well-being and happiness depend fundamentally on obtaining consumer goods and material possessions. This is the kind of statement that we read and say, well, I don't believe that. But then we look at our actions, and we look at our credit cards, and we look at the things that we think about and dream about and wait for and get excited about. Maybe we do believe this. At least many of us operate as if we believe this. And we live within a system that does say the best thing we can do for the economy is to buy, is to spend. We live within a system that does say that increasing the consumption of goods is always a good thing, that will always benefit the economy. But is it always a good thing for society, for culture, for my soul, for my family? These are the questions that we want to be aware of. If we keep thinking about consumerism and go a little bit deeper, we realize there's some nuance to it. William Cavanaugh wrote a great book called Being Consumed. And he says, what really characterizes consumer culture is not attachment to things, but detachment. People do not hoard money, they spend it. People do not cling to things, they discard them and buy other things. We don't really care about what we have, we care about what we might have. He says this: our relationships with products tend to be short-lived. Rather than hoarding treasured objects, consumers are characterized by a constant dissatisfaction with material goods. What I have is never enough because there's something else better coming out. This dissatisfaction is what produces the restless pursuit of satisfaction in the form of something new. Consumerism is not so much about having more as it is about having something new. That's why it is not simply buying, but shopping that is at the heart of consumerism. Buying brings a temporary halt to the restlessness that typifies consumerism. This restlessness, the moving on to shopping for something else, no matter what one has just purchased, sets the spiritual tone for consumerism. That's the world that we live in. And because that's the economic framework we live in, those kinds of things affect our identity. That's what we'll be thinking about next week. For now, we want to recognize that a consumer culture built on capitalism involves both dangers and opportunities. Think about what the creational intentions are behind a consumer culture. There are some things that God would be pleased with: creativity, innovation, art, beauty. Think about how some of those things might have departed from the creational intention. How does capitalism, the structure we live in, make redemptive work possible in the market? How can we enter into the market with redemptive intentions because of how the market operates? But there are dangers as well. How could consumerism prevent an opportunity for transformative products? Does it hold us back from really pursuing God's intent? And if so, are there ways that we could work within the system to still see God's purposes go forth? What connection does capitalism's faith in progress have with God's ultimate plan of redemption? We've talked about how God's work is moving forward. Is that the same as this unbelievably strong conviction that progress is happening in the world? Are they completely different? Are there some compatibilities? How could we maybe speak to God's desire to redeem and restore in a way that resonates with the insistence on progress in our culture? These are the kinds of questions we want to be asking as we think about the philosophical systems of secular humanism and pluralism, the economic systems of capitalism and consumerism. What is the world we live in? What defines it? Who are we as followers of Jesus? And how can we as exiles engage with the world, interact, maintaining who we are, not conforming to culture, but also not escaping, and bringing the presence of Christ and the mind of Christ and all of what it means to follow Jesus into those systems in a unique way? Those are the questions that we'll focus on in our next week as we look at Daniel and as we look at First Peter, thinking about how they provide models for us for what this looks like in practice. Thanks.